I mean, the burden of that is just great. I just wanted to hear you speak to that point. I have to ask about the thing you've brought up a few times, which is making controversial decisions. Let's talk about free speech and censorship. So there are two groups of people pressuring Meta on this. One group is upset that Facebook, the social network, allows misinformation in quotes to be spread on the platform. The other group are concerned that Facebook censors speech by calling it misinformation. So you're getting it from both sides. You, in 2019, October, at Georgetown University, eloquently defended the importance of free speech. But then COVID came, and the 2020 election came. Do you worry that outside pressures from advertisers, politicians, the public have forced Meta to damage the ideal of free speech that you spoke highly of?
Just to say some obvious things up front, I don't think pressure from advertisers or politicians directly in any way affects how we think about this. I think these are just hard topics. So let me just take you through our evolution from kind of the beginning of the company to where we are now. You don't build a company like this unless you believe that people expressing themselves is a good thing, right? So that's sort of the foundational thing. You can kind of think about our company as a formula where we think giving people voice and helping people connect creates opportunity, right? So those are the two things that we're always focused on, are sort of helping people connect. We talked about that a lot, but also giving people voice and ability to express themselves. And by the way, most of the time when people express themselves, that's not like politically controversial content. It's like expressing something about their identity that's more related to the avatar conversation we had earlier in terms of expressing some facet. But that's what's important to people on a day-to-day basis. And sometimes when people feel strongly enough about something, it kind of becomes a political topic. That's sort of always been a thing that we've focused on. There's always been the question of safety in this, which, if you're building a community, I think you have to focus on safety. We've had these community standards from early on. And there are about 20 different kinds of harm that we track and try to fight actively. And we've talked about some of them already. So it includes things like bullying and harassment. It includes things like terrorism or promoting terrorism, inciting violence, intellectual property theft. And in general, I think, call it about 18 out of 20 of those, there's not really a particularly polarized definition of that. I think you're not really going to find many people in the country or in the world who are trying to say we should be fighting terrorist content less. I think that the content where there are a couple of areas where I think that this has gotten more controversial recently, which I'll talk about. And you're right that misinformation is basically is up there, and I think sometimes the definition of hate speech is up there too. Yes. But I think in general, most of the content that I think we're working on for safety is not actually, people don't kind of have these questions. So it's sort of this subset. But if you go back to the beginning of the company, this was sort of pre-deep learning days, and therefore, and it was me and my roommate Dustin joined me, and like if someone posted something bad, it was the AI technology did not exist yet to be able to go basically look at all the content, and we were a small enough outfit that no one would expect that we could review it all. Even if like someone reported it to us, we basically did our best, right? It's like someone would report it and we'd try to look at stuff and deal with stuff. And for call it the first, 7 or 8 years of the company, we weren't that big of a company. For a lot of that period, we weren't even really profitable. The AI didn't really exist to be able to do the kind of moderation that we do today. And then at some point in kind of the middle of the last decade, that started to flip. And it got to the point where we were sort of a larger and more profitable company, and the AI was starting to come online to be able to proactively detect some of the simpler forms of this. So things like pornography. You could train an image classifier to identify what a nipple was, or you can fight against terrorist content.
There's actually papers on this. It's great.
Oh, of course there are.
Technical papers.
Of course there are. Those are relatively easier things to train AI to do than, for example, understand the nuances of what is inciting violence in 100 languages around the world, yes, and not have the false positives of like, okay, are you posting about this thing that might be inciting violence because you're actually trying to denounce it? In which case, we probably shouldn't take that down, right? If you're trying to denounce something that's inciting violence in some kind of dialect in a corner of India, as opposed to, okay, actually, you're posting this thing because you're trying to incite violence. Okay, building an AI that can basically get to that level of nuance in all the languages that we serve is something that I think is only really becoming possible now, not towards the middle of the last decade. But there's been this evolution, and I think what happened, people sort of woke up after 2016, and a lot of people are like, okay, the country is a lot more polarized, and there's a lot more stuff here than we realized. Why weren't these internet companies on top of this? And I think at that point, it was reasonable feedback that some of this technology had started becoming possible. And at that point, I really did feel like we needed to make a substantially larger investment. We'd already worked on this stuff a lot, on AI and on these integrity problems, but that we should basically invest, have 1,000 or more engineers basically work on building these AI systems to be able to go and proactively identify this stuff across all these different areas. Okay, so we went and did that. Now we've built the tools to be able to do that. And now I think it's actually a much more complicated set of philosophical rather than technical questions, which is the exact policies, which are, okay, now the way that we basically hold ourselves accountable is we issue these transparency reports every quarter. And the metric that we track is for each of those 20 types of harmful content, how much of that content are we taking down before someone even has to report it to us, right? So how effective is our AI at doing this? But that basically creates this big question, which is, okay, now we need to really be careful about how proactive we set the AI and where the exact policy lines are around what we're taking down. It's certainly at a point now where, I felt like at the beginning of that journey of building those AI systems, there's a lot of push. There's saying, okay, you've got to do more. There's clearly a lot more bad content that people aren't reporting or that you're not getting to, and you need to get more effective at that. And I was pretty sympathetic to that. But then I think at some point along the way, there started to be almost equal issues on both sides of, okay, actually you're kind of taking down too much stuff, right? Or some of the stuff is borderline, and it wasn't really bothering anyone and they didn't report it. So is that really an issue that you need to take down? Whereas we still have the critique on the other side too, where a lot of people think we're not doing enough. So it's become, as we built the technical capacity, I think it becomes more philosophically interesting almost where you want to be on the line. And I just think like you don't want one person making those decisions. So we've also tried to innovate in terms of building out this independent oversight board, which has people who are dedicated to free expression, but from around the world, who people can appeal cases to. So a lot of the most controversial cases basically go to them and they make the final binding decision on how we should handle that. And then of course their decisions, we then try to figure out what the principles are behind those and encode them into the algorithms.
And how are those people chosen? Which, you're outsourcing a difficult decision.
Yeah, the initial people, we chose a handful of chairs for the group, and we basically chose the people for a commitment to free expression and like a broad understanding of human rights and the trade-offs around free expression, so but fundamentally people who are going to lean towards free expression.
Towards freedom of speech. Okay.
Yeah.
So there's also this idea of fact checkers. So jumping around to the misinformation question, especially during COVID, which is an exceptionally, speaking of polarization.
Yes, can I speak to the COVID thing? And
yes.
I mean, I think one of the hardest set of questions around free expression, because you asked about Georgetown, is my stance fundamentally changed? And the answer to that is no, my stance has not changed. It is fundamentally the same as when I was talking at Georgetown from a philosophical perspective. The challenge with free speech is that everyone agrees that there is a line where if you're actually about to do physical harm to people, that there should be restrictions. So I mean, there's the famous Supreme Court historical example of like you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. The thing that everyone disagrees on is what is the definition of real harm, where I think some people think, okay, this should only be a very literal, I mean, take it back to the bullying conversation we were just having, where is it just harm if the person is about to hurt themselves because they've been bullied so hard? Or is it actually harm like as they're being bullied? And kind of at what point in the spectrum is that? And that's the part that there's not agreement on. But I think what people agree on pretty broadly is that when there is an acute threat, that it does make sense from a societal perspective to tolerate less speech. That could be potentially harmful in that acute situation. So I think where COVID got very difficult is, I don't think anyone expected this to be going on for years. But if you'd kind of asked, a priori, would a global pandemic where a lot of people are dying and catching this, is that an emergency that where you'd kind of consider it that it's problematic to basically yell fire in a crowded theater? I think that probably passes that test. So I think it's a very tricky situation, but I think the fundamental commitment to free expression is there. And that's what I believe. And again, I don't think you start this company unless you care about people being able to express themselves as much as possible. But I think that's the question, right? Is like, how do you define what the harm is and how acute that is?
And what are the institutions that define that harm? A lot of the criticism is that the CDC, the WHO, the institutions we've come to trust as a civilization to give the line of what is and isn't harm in terms of health policy have failed in many ways, in small ways and in big ways, depending on who you ask. And then the perspective of Meta and Facebook is like, well, where the hell do I get the information of what is and isn't misinformation? So it's a really difficult place to be in, but it's great to hear that you're leaning towards freedom of speech on this aspect. And again, I think this actually calls to the fact that we need to reform institutions. that help keep an open mind of what is and isn't misinformation. And misinformation has been used to bully on the internet. I mean, I just have, I'm friends with Joe Rogan, and he is called as a. I remember hanging out with him in Vegas, and somebody yelled, "Stop spreading misinformation." I mean, and there's a lot of people that follow him that believe he's not spreading misinformation. Like, you can't just not acknowledge the fact that there's a large number of people that have a different definition of misinformation. And that's such a tough place to be. Like, who do you listen to? Do you listen to quote unquote experts? Who gets, as a person who has a PhD, I got to say, I mean, I'm not sure I know what defines an expert, especially in a totally new pandemic or a new catastrophic event, especially when politics is involved, and especially when the news are the media are involved that can propagate sort of outrageous narratives and thereby make a lot of money. Like, what the hell? Where's the source of truth? And then everybody turns to Facebook. It's like, please tell me what the source of truth is.
Well, I mean, how would you handle this if you were in my position?
It's very, 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 very difficult. I would say. I would more speak about how difficult the choices are and be transparent about, like, what the hell do you do with this? Like, here, you got exactly ask the exact question you just asked me, but to the broader public. Like, okay, yeah, you guys tell me what to do. So, like, crowdsource it. And then the other aspect is when you spoke really eloquently about the fact that with this, there's this going back and forth, and now there's a feeling like you're censoring a little bit too much. So I would try to be ahead of that feeling. I would now lean towards freedom of speech and say, we're not the ones that are going to define misinformation. Let it be a public debate. Let the idea stand. And I actually place, this idea of misinformation, I place the responsibility on the poor communication skills of scientists. They should be in the battlefield of ideas, and everybody who is spreading information against the vaccine, they should not be censored. They should be talked with, and you should show the data. You should have open discussion, as opposed to rolling your eyes and saying, I'm the expert, I know what I'm talking about. No, you need to convince people. It's a battle of ideas. So that's the whole point of freedom of speech. It's the way to defeat bad ideas is with good ideas, with speech. So, like, the responsibility here falls on the poor communication skills of scientists. Thanks to social media, scientists are not communicators. They have the power to communicate. Some of the best stuff I've seen about COVID from doctors is on social media. It's a way to learn to respond really quickly, to go faster than the peer review process. And so they just need to get way better at that communication. And also, by better, I don't mean just convincing. I also mean speak with humility. Don't talk down to people, all those kinds of things. And as a platform, I would say I would step back a little bit. Not all the way, of course, because there's a lot of stuff that can cause real harm, as we talked about, but you lean more towards freedom of speech, because then people, from a brand perspective, wouldn't be blaming you for the other ills of society, which there are many. The institutions have flaws, the political divide, obviously politicians have flaws, that's news. The media has flaws that they're all trying to work with, and because of the central place of Facebook in the world, all of those flaws somehow kind of propagate to Facebook, and you're sitting there as Plato, the philosopher, have to answer to some of the most difficult questions being asked of human civilization. So I don't know. Maybe this is an American answer, though, to lean towards freedom of speech. I don't know if that applies globally. So yeah, I don't know. But transparency and saying, I think as a technologist, one of the things I sense about Facebook and Meta when people talk about this company is they don't necessarily understand fully how difficult the problem is. You talked about AI has to catch a bunch of harmful stuff really quickly. Just the sea of data you have to deal with. It's a really difficult problem. So, like, any of the critics, if you just hand them the helm for a week, let's see how well you can do.